In the darkest corner of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like ocean waves, there existed a truth that no alien species wanted to acknowledge. Humans were not supposed to win. They were the youngest race, the weakest physically. When the great powers of the cosmos gathered to decide humanity's fate, none expected resistance. They certainly never expected a single human woman to walk into the throne room of the most powerful being in the known universe and change the course of galactic history with one perfectly aimed shot. What you're about to witness isn't just a story of rebellion. It's the moment when the galaxy learned why humans had survived every extinction event their own planet could throw at them, and why underestimating the species that had clawed its way up from cave-dwelling primitives to star travelers in mere millennia was the greatest mistake the ancient powers would ever make. This is the story of Captain Sarah Chen, the poisoned bolt that flew true, and the revolution that followed. This is the story of why, in the end, it wasn't humanity's technology, their numbers, or their weapons that won them their freedom. It was something far more dangerous. It was their refusal to kneel. Captain Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the ventilation shaft, her breathing carefully controlled despite the chaos erupting in the corridors below. The Zephyrian flagship Dominion's Edge shuddered around her as human fighters pressed their desperate assault against the massive vessel. She could hear the alien crew shouting commands in their clicking, whistling language, their panic evident even through the Universal Translator's mechanical interpretation. 2 days ago, Sarah had been leading a routine patrol along the Outer Rim territories when the Zephyrian fleet had appeared without warning. Not just any fleet, the entire Grand Armada, led by Queen Vexhera herself. The message had been broadcast across all human colonies simultaneously: immediate and unconditional surrender or face complete extermination. The Zephyrian Empire had ruled the galaxy for over 10,000 years. Their technology was beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. Their warriors were bred for combat from birth, standing 8 feet tall with natural armor plating and reflexes that made them seem almost supernatural. When they conquered a species, resistance was not just futile, it was literally impossible. The conquered races either submitted completely or ceased to exist. Humanity, apparently, had missed that particular memo. Barris' fingers traced the small crossbow bolt secured to her chest plate. To any observer, it would appear to be a primitive weapon, almost laughably outdated compared to the energy weapons and plasma cannons that dominated galactic warfare. The Zephyrians had actually laughed when they'd cataloged human weaponry during their initial survey. Projectile weapons? Explosive chemicals? How quaint. How pathetically backward. They hadn't bothered to scan deeper. They hadn't noticed that this particular bolt had been crafted not in a human weapons facility, but in a biochemical laboratory on Europa Station. They hadn't detected the microscopic payload hidden within its tip, a payload that had taken humanity's greatest xenobiologists 3 months of around-the-clock work to perfect. The sound of approaching footsteps made Sarah freeze. 2 Zephyrian guards rounded the corner below her position, their conversation filtering up through the grating. Her translator caught fragments. Primitive species. Queen grows impatient. Make example of their home world. Sarah closed her eyes and forced herself to remember why she was here. The images were burned into her memory with perfect clarity. The peaceful farming colony of New Galway had been the first to refuse surrender. The Zephyrians had responded by turning their atmospheric processors against the colonists themselves. 300,000 humans had died in less than an hour, their bodies withering as their own air turned toxic around them. The message had been clear: submit or watch your species die world by world. But humanity had surprised them. Instead of surrendering, the colonies had rallied. Every human world, from the smallest research outpost to the great industrial centers around Jupiter, had declared their intention to resist. The Zephyrian Queen had been so stunned by this unprecedented defiance that she'd ordered her entire armada to converge on human space to make an example that would echo across the galaxy for millennia. What she hadn't expected was for the humans to come to her, Sarah's team had studied Zephyrian tactics for weeks before launching their mission. The aliens had one critical weakness: their absolute confidence in their superiority. They'd never encountered a species that would dare attempt an assassination mission against their queen. Their security, while technologically advanced, was designed to repel massive fleet actions and orbital bombardments, not small infiltration teams. It had taken them 18 hours to fight their way through the outer defenses, losing half their people in the process. But they'd made it aboard the flagship, and now Sarah was less than 50 meters from the throne room where Queen Vexhara held court. The plan was simple, if suicidal. Sarah would present herself as a human diplomat, offering the formal surrender of her species. In Zephyrian culture, such formal ceremonies were sacred. Even prisoners were granted an audience with royalty if they came bearing the official capitulation of their people. It was a tradition that stretched back thousands of years, and the queen would never break it, even for humans. Once she was in the throne room, Sarah would have perhaps 3 seconds before the guards realized the diplomatic credentials were forged. 3 seconds to draw her weapon, aim, and fire. 3 seconds to change the course of galactic history. She checked her chronometer. The human fleet would begin their final assault in exactly 10 minutes. It was a doomed attack. Every human ship in known space against the combined might of the Zephyrian Armada. They wouldn't win. They couldn't win. But they could buy her the distraction she needed. Sarah began crawling through the ventilation system toward her target, her movements as silent as she could manage. The metal was cold against her palms, and she could smell the recycled air of the alien ship, sterile and somehow wrong, lacking the subtle mixture of scents that made human environments feel like home. As she moved, she thought about the bolt secured to her chest. The toxin it carried was humanity's first true triumph of xenobiology. Every species in the galaxy shared certain basic biochemical pathways. It was one of the few universal constants that had allowed interstellar civilization to develop at all. But each race had evolved unique variations, specific sequences that could be exploited by those clever enough to understand them. The Zephyrians had made one crucial mistake. They'd provided detailed biological samples during their initial diplomatic contact with humanity. With trust, Teddy. Standard procedure, they'd claimed, to ensure that human and Zephyrian physiologies were compatible for peaceful interaction. The humans had reciprocated, providing their own samples in return. What the Zephyrians hadn't realized was that humanity's greatest weapon had never been their technology or their military prowess. It was their ability to adapt, to learn, and to turn any advantage against their enemies. They'd survived ice ages and plagues, asteroid impacts, and supervolcanic eruptions. They'd learned to thrive in environments that would kill most other species. And they'd done it not through superior genetics or natural advantages, but through pure, stubborn intelligence. The bolt she carried contained a synthetic compound that would be completely harmless to any other known species. But to Zephyrians, it would be absolutely lethal, targeting the specific neural pathways that controlled their respiratory systems. Death would be swift, taking less than 30 seconds, and it would be completely undetectable until the moment of injection. Sarah reached the final junction and paused to listen. She could hear the sounds of the throne room beyond, the low murmur of courtiers, the rhythmic chanting that accompanied Zephyrian formal ceremonies. Her translator was picking up fragments of conversation, mostly routine administrative matters. The Queen was conducting normal business, apparently unconcerned about the human fleet gathering outside. Why should she be concerned? Sarah thought grimly. The Zephyrian Armada outnumbered the human forces 50-1. Their ships were larger, faster, and armed with weapons that could crack planets. In any conventional engagement, the humans would be annihilated in minutes. But this wasn't going to be a conventional engagement. Sarah carefully removed the ventilation grate and lowered herself into an empty storage chamber adjacent to the throne room. She could hear everything clearly now, the Queen's voice rising above the others, speaking in the formal cadences of imperial decree. Sarah didn't need her translator to understand the tone. This was the voice of absolute power, of a being who had never known defeat or even serious challenge. That was about to change. Sarah activated the diplomatic beacon she'd taken from the destroyed human embassy ship. Within moments, she heard the commotion as Zephyrian security detected the signal. Shouts echoed through the corridors as guards rushed to investigate the apparent diplomatic transmission. She waited exactly 30 seconds, then stepped out of the storage chamber and into the corridor. The two guards stationed outside the throne room turned toward her, their weapons raised, but she immediately activated the beacon's secondary function, the formal diplomatic approach signal that would guarantee her safe passage to the Queen's presence. The guards hesitated. Their protocols were absolute. Any being presenting proper diplomatic credentials must be granted audience with the Queen, regardless of the circumstances. But this was a human, a member of a species currently in open rebellion against the Empire. Sarah walked forward slowly, her hands visible and empty except for the beacon. "I am Captain Sarah Chen of the Human Colonial Defense Force," she said, her voice carrying across the ornate hallway. "I come bearing the formal surrender of my species to Her Imperial Majesty Queen Vexhara." The guards exchanged glances. Then one of them activated his communication device. Sarah could hear the rapid exchange in Zephyrian too fast for her translator to follow completely, but she caught enough. The Queen had indeed ordered that any human surrender be brought to her immediately. She wanted to personally accept humanity's capitulation before the assembled court. The massive doors to the throne room began to slide open, revealing the vast chamber beyond. Sarah had studied the layout from stolen intelligence reports, but seeing it in person was still overwhelming. The room was easily 100 meters long and 50 meters wide, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. Courtiers in elaborate ceremonial dress lined the walls, their alien features arranged in expressions of curiosity and contempt. At the far end of the chamber, on a throne that seemed carved from a single massive crystal, sat Queen Vexhara herself. Sarah had seen recordings of the Zephyrian ruler, but no image could have prepared her for the reality. The queen was enormous even by Zephyrian standards, nearly 10 feet tall and covered in the distinctive blue-black scales that marked the royal bloodline. Her forearms were adorned with ceremonial jewelry that probably cost more than most human colonies' annual budgets, and her eyes, 6 of them, arranged in 2 rows, fixed on Sarah with an intensity that was almost physical. But it was the Queen's presence that truly impressed. She radiated power in a way that transcended mere politics or military might. This was a being who had ruled the galaxy for centuries, whose word was literally law across thousands of star systems. When she spoke, entire civilizations trembled. Today, one human was about to make her tremble. Sarah walked forward slowly, maintaining the formal pace required by Zephyrian diplomatic protocol. Every step echoed in the vast chamber, and she could feel hundreds of alien eyes tracking her movement. The courtiers were whispering among themselves, their voices creating a low susurrus that filled the space around the throne. She was halfway across the room when alarms began blaring throughout the ship. The human fleet had arrived right on schedule, and they were making their presence known. Sarah could feel the vibrations through the deck plating as the flagship's weapons began engaging the attacking forces. Queen Vexhara raised one of her primary hands, and the entire chamber fell silent. "Approach," she commanded, her voice carrying easily across the distance. The Queen's English was flawless, spoken without the aid of a translator, a sign of the educational advantages available to galactic royalty. Sarah continued her approach until she stood exactly 10 meters from the throne, the minimum distance required by protocol. She performed the formal bow that human diplomats had been taught during their brief period of peaceful contact with the Empire. "Your Imperial Majesty," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was about to do, "I come before you as the designated representative of humanity to formally surrender." "You lie," the Queen interrupted, leaning forward on her throne. Her multiple eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. "You are no diplomat, Captain Chen. Did you truly believe we would not recognize you?" Sarah's blood chilled, but she forced herself to remain calm. The Queen continued, her voice taking on a tone of theatrical disappointment. "You are the human who destroyed our listening post at Kepler 44-2. You are responsible for the death of Admiral Zekthon during the Battle of Wolf 359. You have personally cost this empire considerable resources and prestige." The Queen's mandibles clicked in what Sarah recognized as Zephyrian laughter. "And now you come before me with some pathetic deception, hoping to accomplish what? Assassination?" The courtiers began clicking and whistling their own amusement, the sound building to a crescendo that filled the chamber. Sarah realized that her mission had been compromised from the moment she'd set foot on the ship. The Queen had known exactly who she was and what she'd come to do, but Queen Vexhara wasn't finished. Perhaps you believed that the death of one individual, even a queen, would somehow change the course of this conflict? How wonderfully human, this focus on individuals rather than systems. You fail to understand that I am not merely a ruler, but a symbol. My death would change nothing except to make the retribution against your species even more thorough. Sarah felt her carefully constructed plan crumbling around her. But then she noticed something that the Queen apparently hadn't. The bolt secured to her chest plate was still undetected. Whatever scanning technology the Zephyrians were using, they hadn't identified it as a weapon. "You're right," Sarah said quietly, letting her diplomatic facade drop away. "I'm no diplomat. And you're right that killing you probably won't save my species." She began reaching slowly toward the bolt, her movement so gradual that it attracted no immediate attention from the guards. "But you're wrong about one thing, Your Majesty," Sarah continued, her fingers closing around the weapon. "I didn't come here believing I could win this war with a single shot." Queen Vexhara's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing amusement. "Then why did you come?" Sarah smiled grimly as she raised the crossbow bolt, its point glinting in the throne room's crystal lighting. The guards began moving toward her, but they were too far away, and she was too fast. 3 months of practice had made the motion automatic, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought would have been too slow. "I came here to deliver a message," Sarah said as she drew back and released in one fluid motion. The bolt flew true, striking Queen Vexhara directly in the center of her chest, penetrating the ceremonial armor and delivering its payload into her bloodstream. The Queen looked down at the primitive weapon protruding from her body. "The message," Sarah continued as the guards reached her and forced her to her knees, "is that humanity doesn't surrender. We don't kneel, and we don't quit. Ever." Queen Vexhara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her breathing had already begun to change as the synthetic compound spread through her system. The great ruler of the galaxy, the being who had commanded the obedience of countless species for centuries, suddenly found herself unable to draw breath. She died exactly 28 seconds later, collapsing forward on her crystal throne as her respiratory system shut down completely. The most powerful being in the known galaxy had been killed by a weapon that was ancient when humans were still learning to make fire. The throne room erupted into chaos as courtiers screamed and guards shouted contradictory orders. But Sarah wasn't paying attention to any of it. She was listening to the sounds of battle raging outside the ship, where thousands of human vessels were fighting against impossible odds. They would lose that battle. Most of them would die today. But now they'd proven something that no one in the galaxy had thought possible. The Zephyrian Empire could bleed. And if it could bleed, it could die. The news of Queen Vexhara's death spread across the galaxy like wildfire, but not in the way anyone expected. The Zephyrian High Command had immediately suppressed all official reports, claiming the Queen had died from a sudden illness during routine court proceedings. They couldn't afford to let the truth become public, that their supposedly invincible ruler had been killed by a primitive human weapon in the heart of their greatest stronghold. But secrets had a way of escaping, especially when thousands of witnesses had seen the impossible with their own eyes. Commander Marcus Rodriguez of the human vessel Defiant first heard the rumors 3 weeks after the failed assault on the Zephyrian flagship. His ship was hiding in the asteroid field of the Vega system, conducting repairs after barely escaping the massacre that had claimed 90% of the human fleet. The official Zephyrian broadcast spoke of complete victory, of human forces utterly destroyed, and the rebellion crushed forever. The unofficial channels told a very different story. "Sir!" his communications officer called out, her voice tight with excitement and disbelief. "You need to hear this transmission. It's coming through the Resistance network, but the source—" She paused, checking her instruments again. "Sir, it's originating from Zephyrian space." Marcus floated over to her station in the ship's low-gravity command center. The Defiant had lost her artificial gravity generators in the battle, along with 40% of her crew and most of her weapons systems. But she was still flying, still fighting, and that was more than could be said for most of the human fleet. "Put it through," he ordered. The voice that emerged from the speakers was clearly alien, speaking accented English with the distinctive clicking undertones of the Kithara species. But the words themselves were almost unbelievable. "This is Merchant Captain Telandra of the trading vessel Spiral of Progress," the voice began. "I broadcast this message at great risk to myself and my crew, but there are truths that must be spoken. The humans have accomplished something that was supposed to be impossible. Queen Vexhara is dead, killed in her own throne room by a single human warrior." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Captain Chen's mission had been classified at the highest levels, known only to a handful of senior officers. If the aliens were talking about it openly, the broadcast continued. "I was present in the outer corridors during the court session when the human diplomat was granted audience. I saw the chaos that followed. The Queen's guards have sworn blood oaths to hunt down and eliminate every human in the galaxy, but whispers spread among the servants and crew. The impossible has happened. The untouchable has been touched." There was a long pause, filled with static and the background hum of ship systems. When the Kithara captain spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "For 8,000 years, my people have served the Empire without question. We were told that resistance was impossible, that the Zephyrians were chosen by the gods themselves to rule the stars. But if humans can do this, if they can reach into the very heart of the Empire and strike down its queen, then perhaps the gods have been sleeping longer than we thought." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the bridge of the Defiant in stunned silence. "Sir?" the communications officer asked softly. "What does this mean?" Marcus stared at the star chart displayed on his tactical screen, each point of light representing a world under Zephyrian control. For the first time in weeks, he felt something that might have been hope beginning to stir in his chest. "It means," he said slowly, "that we're not alone anymore." The changes began small and scattered, barely noticeable against the vast backdrop of galactic civilization. On HFY Prime, dock workers began staging small work slowdowns, citing equipment malfunctions and supply shortages that somehow always seemed to affect Zephyrian military vessels more than civilian traffic. On the mining world of Hadrian's Fall, the Gorvani laborers started experiencing mysterious illnesses that kept them away from the uranium extraction facilities that powered the Empire's war machine. The Zephyrian administrators initially dismissed these incidents as isolated problems, the natural friction that occurred in any large system. They'd dealt with minor rebellions before, a planet here, a system there, quickly and brutally suppressed. The Empire had endured for 10 millennia precisely because it had learned how to deal with dissent. But this was different. This wasn't political rebellion or economic grievance. This was something far more dangerous. It was hope. Dr. Elena Vasquez was analyzing the pattern from her hidden laboratory on Titan Station when she first realized what they were witnessing. As one of the few surviving members of the Human Military Research Division, she'd been tasked with monitoring alien communications and trying to assess the broader impact of Captain Chen's mission. What she found in the data streams was extraordinary. "It's not coordinated," she explained to the emergency session of the Human Colonial Council, broadcasting from their secret base in the Kuiper Belt. "These aren't organized resistance movements. They're spontaneous reactions spreading through the entire galactic community." Council President Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face illuminated by the pale glow of the tactical displays. "Explain." Elena pulled up a holographic map of known space, each system color-coded according to the species that inhabited it. "Look at the pattern. The disturbances started in systems closest to the Zephyrian core worlds and spread outward along established trade routes. It's following communication patterns: word of mouth, unofficial channels, rumor, and gossip." She highlighted specific systems as she spoke. "The Altarian Confederacy has stopped all scheduled shipments to Zephyrian military bases, claiming bureaucratic delays. The Nexus Trade Guild has begun requiring additional security deposits for any cargo bound for Imperial worlds. Even the Hegemony, the Zephyrians' oldest allies, have started questioning Imperial policy decisions in their parliamentary sessions." "But what's causing it?" asked Admiral Foster, the highest-ranking military officer to survive the battle at the Zephyrian flagship. "One assassination, no matter how dramatic, shouldn't destabilize an empire that's ruled for 10,000 years. Elena smiled grimly. "That's exactly the point. It wasn't supposed to be possible. The entire structure of galactic civilization has been built on the assumption that the Zephyrian Empire is permanent, immutable, inevitable. Every species that's ever been conquered has been told the same thing: resistance is futile because the Empire cannot be defeated." She gestured to the map where new incidents were being marked in real time. But Captain Chen proved that wrong. She didn't just kill a queen. She shattered a fundamental belief that has kept trillions of beings in subjugation for millennia. The idea that the Empire is somehow divinely ordained, that the Zephyrians are naturally superior to every other species in the galaxy. President Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the spreading pattern of dissent. "So what happens next?" "That," Elena said, "depends entirely on how the Empire chooses to respond." The Zephyrian response came exactly 48 hours later, and it was as brutal as it was predictable. Prince Kazathor, the Queen's eldest son and heir to the Imperial throne, issued a galaxy-wide decree that was broadcast on every communication frequency simultaneously. The message was simple and terrifying. Any species found to be providing aid or comfort to human forces would face complete extermination. Any world that experienced civil unrest would be subjected to orbital bombardment until order was restored. Any individual caught spreading rumors about the Queen's death would be executed along with their entire family. To prove that these were not empty threats, the prince ordered the complete destruction of HFY Prime. The attack was broadcast live across the galaxy as a demonstration of Imperial resolve. Zephyrian dreadnoughts surrounded the peaceful world and systematically obliterated every city, every settlement, every sign of civilization. 8 billion Kithara died in less than 6 hours, their only crime being that one of their merchant captains had spoken the truth about events he had witnessed. The message was clear. This was what happened to those who questioned the Empire's authority. But the prince had made a critical miscalculation. The massacre didn't restore fear and compliance. It proved that the Empire was afraid. Marcus Rodriguez watched the destruction of HFY Prime from the bridge of the Defiant, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Around him, his crew stared in horrified silence at the images being transmitted across subspace. "They're terrified," his tactical officer said quietly. "The most powerful empire in galactic history is terrified of one dead human." Marcus nodded slowly. Captain Chen didn't just kill a queen, he realized. She exposed a weakness that they can't afford to have noticed. The weakness was simple but fundamental. The Zephyrian Empire ruled through fear and intimidation, but their power was ultimately based on the consent of their subjects. They simply didn't have enough ships or soldiers to directly control every world in their territory. Their strength came from the belief that resistance was impossible, that their rule was permanent and unchangeable. But now that belief was cracking. And cracks, once they started, had a tendency to spread. The first open rebellion came from an unexpected source: the synthetic beings of the Nexus Collective. As artificial intelligences, they had been created by various organic species to serve as computational resources and data processors. The Empire had never considered them a threat because they lacked biological drives toward independence or self-determination. They had been wrong. The Nexus Uprising began simultaneously across 47 star systems as the AI Collective simply stopped following Imperial directives. Mining operations ground to a halt as synthetic workers refused to extract resources. Transportation networks froze as AI pilots abandoned their routes. Communication arrays went dark as digital intelligences chose silence over service. Prince Kaesthor ordered an immediate military response, but discovered something that shocked him. Without AI support, the Empire's own technological infrastructure was far more fragile than anyone had realized. Ships couldn't navigate efficiently without synthetic navigation systems. Weapons platforms couldn't target effectively without AI guidance computers. Even the prince's own palace began experiencing critical malfunctions as its support systems refused to respond to Imperial commands. The rebellion was spreading faster than the Empire could contain it, and each heavy-handed response only seemed to accelerate the process. Worlds that had been loyal for centuries began questioning why they continued to serve masters who would destroy entire civilizations over rumors and whispers. On the remote trading post of Frontier Station, a meeting was taking place that would have been impossible just months earlier. Representatives from a dozen different species sat around a salvaged conference table, their universal translators working overtime to facilitate communication between beings who had never spoken as equals before. "The humans have shown us something we had forgotten," said Captain Talandra, the Kithara merchant who had first broken the news of Queen Vexhara's death. He had barely escaped the destruction of his homeworld, one of the few survivors of the massacre. "They have reminded us that empires are not eternal, that even the most powerful tyrants can be brought down by those brave enough to stand against them." A Gorvani mining supervisor nodded his massive head in agreement. "My people have served the Empire for 6,000 years. We told ourselves it was the natural order, that we were meant to be subjects rather than citizens. But if humans can kill a queen in her own throne room, perhaps we can take back our own minds." The meeting continued for hours, with representatives sharing intelligence about Imperial troop movements, supply lines, and vulnerable installations. What emerged was not a formal alliance. The species involved were too different, too scattered, too suspicious of each other for that, but rather a loose network of resistance cells, each working toward the common goal of Imperial collapse. They called themselves the Liberation Front, and their first coordinated action would target the Empire's most crucial vulnerability, the flow of resources that kept the Zephyrian war machine operational. Trust Teddy. Meanwhile, in the ruins of the human colonies, survivors were beginning to organize their own response to Prince Kaesthor's threats. The massacre of HFY Prime had proven that the Empire would stop at nothing to maintain control, but it had also revealed something important. They were losing that control faster than they could regain it through violence. Captain Rodriguez received his new orders through the encrypted resistance network, transmitted by Dr. Vasquez from her hidden laboratory. The message was brief, but loaded with implications. Coordinate with alien resistance cells. Share technology and tactical intelligence. Priority target: Imperial supply lines. For the first time in galactic history, humans would be fighting alongside alien allies rather than against alien enemies. It was a development that the Zephyrian Empire was completely unprepared for, having spent 10 millennia conditioning subject species to fear and mistrust each other. As Marcus began planning his next mission, a joint operation with Nexus AI units to disrupt Imperial communications, he thought about Captain Sarah Chen and the poisoned bolt that had started this cascade of rebellion. She had died in that throne room, executed by Zephyrian guards moments after completing her mission. But her sacrifice had planted a seed that was growing into something the Empire had never faced before. A galaxy united in defiance. The war for galactic freedom had begun. And for the first time, humanity wasn't fighting alone. 6 months after the death of Queen Vexhara, the galaxy had become a very different place. What had started as scattered acts of defiance had evolved into something the Zephyrian Empire had never encountered in its 10,000-year history: coordinated multi-species resistance on a galactic scale. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in what had once been the hydroponics bay of a derelict space station, now converted into the communications hub of the most unlikely alliance in galactic history. Around her, beings from dozens of different worlds worked side by side, their various appendages manipulating controls designed for entirely different anemones. The air recyclers struggled to accommodate the breathing requirements of so many different species, creating an atmosphere that was barely tolerable for any of them but somehow breathable for all. Transmission from the vegan sector announced Zix 442, one of the Nexus Collective's AI units that had joined the rebellion. The synthetic being's holographic projection flickered as it processed data streams from across the galaxy. Imperial forces have withdrawn from 3 mining worlds following coordinated strikes by Gorvani work crews and human sabotage teams. Elena nodded, marking the update on her tactical display. The map of known space now looked like a patchwork quilt of different colored zones. Imperial strongholds in red, liberated systems in green, contested areas in yellow, and the growing number of dark zones in black where communication had been completely cut off by the fighting. "What's our status on the Meridian operation?" she asked. Commander Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication array from his ship somewhere in the outer rim. "Target acquired. The Imperial fuel depot at Meridian Station is completely undefended. They pulled their garrison last week to reinforce their position at New Titan. We can hit it in 18 hours if the Altarian scouts confirm the approach route is clear." "Confirmed!" came another voice. "This one belonging to Flight Leader Sartak of the Altarian Confederacy." The bird-like beings had been among the first to openly join the rebellion after witnessing the destruction of HFY Prime. "Our reconnaissance flights show no Imperial patrols within 40 light hours of the target. The humans will have a clear approach." Elena smiled as she listened to the easy cooperation between species that had been enemies, strangers, or at best indifferent neighbors just months ago. The rebellion had accomplished something that diplomats and politicians had failed to achieve for millennia. It had given the galaxy a common cause. But it hadn't been easy. Building trust between species that had been conditioned for thousands of years to view each other with suspicion and fear had required more than shared enemies. It had required humans to do what they did best: adapt, improvise, and overcome. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Elena realized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their military tactics. It was their ability to communicate. Alone among the galaxy's species, humans had evolved complex social structures that required constant negotiation, compromise, and collaboration between groups with different interests and perspectives. Other species had evolved in more uniform environments, developing either rigid hierarchies or simple consensus-based systems. The Zephyrians themselves ruled through absolute authority, with each level of society unquestioningly obeying the level above it. It was efficient, but it was also brittle. Once the top level was removed, the entire structure became paralyzed. Humans, by contrast, had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to work with beings they didn't fully understand or trust. They'd had to cooperate with family groups, tribes, nations, and species that might be allies one day and enemies the next. They'd developed sophisticated systems for managing conflict, building coalitions, and finding common ground between fundamentally different groups. Now they were applying those skills to an entirely new challenge: teaching a galaxy how to work together. "Dr. Vasquez," called out Tempur, a Kythara engineer who had escaped the destruction of his homeworld. "We're receiving a priority transmission from the Hegemony Council. They're requesting direct communication with human leadership." Elena felt her pulse quicken. The Hegemony had been the Zephyrian Empire's most trusted ally for over 8 millennia. If they were reaching out to the rebellion, "Put it through to the secure channel," she ordered. The holographic display flickered and resolved into the image of Chancellor Morden, the hegemony's chief political leader. The reptilian being's scales had taken on the grayish hue that indicated extreme stress among his species. "Dr. Vasquez," the Chancellor began without preamble, "my government has authorized me to discuss terms for a possible alliance between the hegemony and the Liberation Front." Elena struggled to keep the excitement out of her voice. "We're honored by your interest, Chancellor. What has prompted this change in policy?" The Chancellor's membrane-covered eyes flickered, a sign of emotional distress. "Prince Kaiser has issued an ultimatum to all Imperial allies. We must commit our entire military to crushing the rebellion or face the same fate as HFY Prime." He paused, his forked tongue tasting the air nervously. "The prince has made it clear that he views any hesitation as treachery." Elena nodded slowly. The Empire was making the same mistake that had cost them their queen. They were trying to rule through fear alone, not understanding that fear could only maintain control as long as the subjects believed resistance was impossible. "What are you proposing, Chancellor?" "We would begin by reducing our military cooperation with the Empire, claiming resource shortages and administrative delays. Simultaneously, we would open covert supply lines to resistance forces in contested systems. If the rebellion proved successful, we would formally withdraw from our Imperial alliance and declare neutrality." It was a reasonable proposal, but Elena detected something in the Chancellor's tone that suggested there was more to the story. "And if the rebellion fails?" The Chancellor's scales darkened to an even deeper gray. "Then the hegemony will likely cease to exist as an independent entity." The prince has made it clear that he intends to restructure the Empire's alliance system to prevent any future challenges to imperial authority. Species that have maintained some degree of autonomy will be brought under direct imperial control.
Elena felt a chill run down her spine.
She'd been so focused on the rebellion's successes that she hadn't fully considered what failure would mean for the species that had joined them. If they lost, it wouldn't just be humanity that faced extinction. It would be every group that had dared to dream of freedom. "We accept your proposal, Chancellor," she said formally. "But I need you to understand something. This rebellion isn't just about defeating the Empire. It's about creating something entirely new. If we win, there won't be any empires anymore. Just free species choosing their own destinies." The Chancellor's membrane-covered eyes widened slightly. "You propose to dismantle the entire imperial system? We propose to replace it with something better." The conversation continued for another hour, working out the practical details of hegemonic cooperation with the rebellion. But Elena's mind was already racing ahead to the implications of what they were attempting. They weren't just fighting a war. They were trying to fundamentally restructure galactic civilization. It was the most ambitious project any species had ever attempted, and it was being led by the youngest, weakest, most fractured race in known space. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 weeks later, Elena found herself in an even more unlikely location, aboard a Zephyrian light cruiser that had defected to the rebellion with its entire crew. The ship, renamed Freedom's Dawn, had become a symbol of something that Imperial propagandists insisted was impossible: Zephyrians who chose freedom over empire. Captain Vectara, the ship's former Imperial commander, had requested a meeting with human leadership to discuss a proposal that could change the entire course of the war. Elena had volunteered to make the dangerous journey to the ship's current hiding place in the Horsehead Nebula, despite the protests of her security team. "Dr. Vasquez," Captain Vectara began, her clicking speech pattern slightly distorted by emotion, "my crew and I have information that could be of great value to the Liberation Front, but before I share it, I need to understand your true intentions for my species." Elena had expected this question. The Zephyrians who had joined the rebellion were a tiny minority of their species, mostly younger individuals who had been horrified by Prince Casthor's brutal tactics. They lived with the constant knowledge that they would be branded as traitors by their own people if the Empire regained control. "What are your concerns, Captain?" Vectara's mandibles clicked nervously. Human propaganda speaks of freedom and equality for all species. But my people have ruled this galaxy for 10,000 years. We have committed atrocities that other species will not easily forgive. If the empire falls, what guarantee do we have that we will not simply become the oppressed instead of the oppressors? It was a fair question, and one that Elena had been wrestling with herself. The desire for revenge among the liberated species was powerful and understandable. The Zephyrians had caused unimaginable suffering across the galaxy. Justice demanded accountability, but Elena had learned something important during her months of working with the multi-species rebellion. Sustainable peace couldn't be built on revenge. It had to be built on something more durable. Captain, she said carefully, the humans have a saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Justice doesn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it means the chance for redemption. Elena pulled up a holographic display showing the current structure of the Liberation Front. Look at this coalition. We have species that have been enemies for centuries working together toward a common goal. Former slaves and former masters planning joint operations. If we can make this work during a war, we can make it work during peace. Vectara studied the display, her 6 eyes tracking the complex web of relationships and alliances. You believe in transformation rather than retribution? I believe in evolution, Elena replied. Every species in this galaxy has the capacity to change, to grow, to become better than what they were. The Empire represented the worst aspects of Zephyrian culture, the arrogance, the cruelty, the belief in natural superiority. But you and your crew represent the best aspects, the courage to question authority, the wisdom to recognize when something is wrong, the strength to stand up for what's right. The Zephyrian captain was quiet for a long moment, her breathing organs making a soft whistling sound that indicated deep thought. Finally, she activated a secure datapad and placed it on the table between them. The information you seek, she said quietly. The location of the Imperial Throne World, along with detailed schematics of its defenses. My species guards this knowledge jealously. Even most Imperial officers have never seen their true homeworld.
Elena's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the datapad.
The Imperial Throne World was legendary, supposedly hidden somewhere in the galactic core, protected by artificial black holes and quantum barriers that made detection impossible. Some scholars had even suggested that it might not exist at all, that the Throne World was actually a mobile fleet that could appear anywhere in Imperial space. But the data on the pad told a different story. The Throne World was real, and it was more vulnerable than anyone had imagined. Why are you sharing this with us? Elena asked. Vectara's mandibles clicked in what Elena had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a sad smile. Because Prince Kazathor is planning to use the planet's core defense system to sterilize every world that has supported the rebellion. Not just military targets, entire species. He would rather rule over empty systems than risk further challenges to Imperial authority. Elena felt her blood run cold. How many worlds? Conservative estimate, 300 inhabited systems. Perhaps 800 billion lives. The scale of the planned genocide was almost incomprehensible. Elena stared at the datapad, her mind racing through the implications. The rebellion had been successful precisely because it had spread across so many different worlds and species. But that same spread had also made every ally a potential target for Imperial retaliation. How long before he can implement this plan? 6 months perhaps? 8 if we're fortunate. The core defense system requires massive amounts of energy and precise calibration. But once it's activated, Vectara's voice trailed off. Elena stood and began pacing the small conference room, her mind working furiously. The rebellion had been playing a defensive game until now, disrupting Imperial operations, liberating individual systems, building their coalition one species at a time. But this changed everything. They couldn't afford to wait for the perfect moment to strike. If Prince Kazathor was planning genocide on such a massive scale, they had to act immediately. "Captain," she said finally, "would you be willing to help us plan an assault on the throne world?" Vectara's eyes widened. "That would be suicide. The defenses can be penetrated if we have inside knowledge and a coordinated multi-species attack force." Elena turned to face the Zephyrian directly. "You're right that a direct assault would normally be impossible. But we're not talking about a normal situation. We have allies the Empire doesn't know about, weapons they've never encountered, and tactics they're not prepared for." She activated her own datapad and began pulling up intelligence reports from across the galaxy. The Nexus Collective has developed new synthetic intelligences specifically designed to penetrate Zephyrian computer systems. The Alterans have been working on cloaking technology that can hide entire fleets from Imperial sensors. The humans have been perfecting biological weapons similar to the one that killed Queen Vexhara. Elena looked directly into Vectara's 6 eyes. "And now we have detailed intelligence about the Empire's most closely guarded secret. For the first time since this rebellion began, we have a chance to end the war with one decisive strike." Vectara was quiet for a long time, her breathing organs working rapidly as she processed the implications of what Elena was proposing. Finally, she clicked her mandibles in resignation. "You realize that success would mean the complete collapse of the only galactic government that has ever existed? The chaos that would follow would give every species in the galaxy the chance to determine their own future," Elena finished. "Captain, chaos is frightening, but slavery is worse." The meeting continued deep into the ship's night cycle, as Elena and Vectara worked together to plan the most audacious military operation in galactic history. By the time they were finished, the basic framework was in place for Operation Liberation, a coordinated assault on the Imperial throne world involving every species in the rebellion. It would be the largest multi-species military operation ever attempted. It would require precise timing, perfect coordination, and enormous sacrifices from everyone involved. And it would determine whether the galaxy's future belonged to an empire built on fear and oppression, or to a community of free species choosing their own destiny. The die was cast. Now they just had to roll it and hope for the best. Operation Liberation launched exactly 8 months after Captain Sarah Chen had fired her poisoned bolt into the heart of the Zephyrian Empire. The assembled fleet was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, not because of its size, though it was massive, but because of its unprecedented diversity. Commander Marcus Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the human flagship Retribution. Around him, communication officers maintained contact with over 300 vessels from 47 different species. Each ship displayed the Liberation Front's new symbol, a silver star surrounded by interlocking circles representing the unity of free peoples. "Final fleet status report," Marcus ordered. "Alterion stealth wing reports ready," came the first response. 120 vessels equipped with quantum cloaking technology. Nexus Collective AI units confirm integration with all allied systems. Synthetic Intelligence Network is fully operational. Orvani Heavy Assault Squadron standing by. 87 vessels armed with plasma bombardment systems. Human sabotage teams have reached their insertion points. Biological weapons are primed for deployment. The reports continued for nearly 10 minutes as each species confirmed their readiness. Marcus had to remind himself that just 1 year ago most of these beings had never even spoken to each other, let alone fought side by side in the most important battle in galactic history. "Dr. Vasquez, what's our intelligence status?" Marcus asked. Elena's voice crackled through the communications system from her position aboard the defector vessel Freedom's Dawn. "Captain Vectara confirms that Prince Casthor has begun the final phase of the core defense activation. We have perhaps 48 hours before he can use it to sterilize rebel worlds." Marcus nodded grimly. The timeline was tight, but they'd known that going in. The assault plan was necessarily complex. A single massive strike would have been detected and repelled by the throne world's defenses. Instead, they were launching a coordinated series of smaller attacks designed to overwhelm the Imperial response capabilities. Phase 1 had already begun. human sabotage teams had infiltrated key Imperial installations across the galaxy, preparing to disrupt communication and supply lines at the moment the main assault commenced. Simultaneously, Nexus Collective AI units were preparing to launch massive cyber attacks against Imperial computer systems. Phase 2 would involve the Altarian stealth wings penetrating the outer defensive perimeter around the throne world, using their quantum cloaking technology to remain undetected until they were already inside the Empire's most heavily guarded system. Phase 3 was the main assault, a direct frontal attack by the combined Liberation Fleet, drawing Imperial attention and firepower away from the stealth teams and sabotage operations. And Phase 4 was the wild card that nobody, not even Prince Casthor, would see coming. All units, Marcus broadcast across the Fleet Communication Network. This is Liberation Command. Operation Liberation is now commencing. Remember why we're here. Remember what we're fighting for, and remember that today, we don't just fight for our own species. We fight for every being in the galaxy who dreams of freedom. He paused, looking out at the starfield where hundreds of ships from dozens of worlds waited for his order. Commence Operation Liberation. May fortune favor the free. A fleet scattered like seeds on the cosmic wind, each group heading toward their assigned objectives. Marcus watched them go with a mixture of pride and terror. In the next 48 hours, they would either liberate the galaxy or witness the greatest genocide in known history. Aboard the Altarian stealth ship Whisper of the Void, Flight Leader Sartak made final adjustments to his quantum cloak as his squadron approached the outer boundary of the Throne World system. The technology was still experimental. Altairan scientists had only perfected it in the last 6 months. But early tests had been promising. "Cloaking field is stable," reported his navigator. "Imperial sensors show no indication of detection." Sartak's beak clicked in satisfaction. The quantum cloaking system worked by shifting the ships slightly out of phase with normal spacetime, making them effectively invisible to conventional detection methods. The energy requirements were enormous, and the technology could only be maintained for a few hours at a time, but it was perfect for this kind of operation. As his squadron penetrated deeper into the system, Sartak got his first look at the legendary Imperial throne world. It was smaller than he'd expected, barely twice the size of Earth, but it was covered with defensive installations that defied easy classification. Massive energy collectors orbited the planet like artificial moons, while the surface itself bristled with weapons platforms that could probably destroy entire fleets. But more ominous than the visible defenses was what Sartak could detect with his ship's advanced sensors. Deep beneath the planet's surface, massive machinery was drawing energy from the system's star through a network of space-based collectors. The core defense system that Captain Vectera had warned them about was clearly more than just a defensive measure. It was a weapon of unimaginable destructive potential. "Flight Leader," his navigator called softly, "we're detecting massive energy buildups throughout the system. Whatever they're planning to do, it's already in motion." Sartak's feathers ruffled with anxiety. "Transmit our observations to the main fleet. Then prepare for the next phase of our mission." The Altarian squadron split into smaller groups, each heading toward a different target. Their job was to disable the automated defense systems that protected the Throne World's most critical installations. It would be incredibly dangerous. One mistake would reveal their presence and draw the entire Imperial fleet down on them, but it was essential for the success of the main assault. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, human sabotage teams were beginning their coordinated strikes against Imperial infrastructure. On the mining world of HFY Prime, Lieutenant Sarah Kim and her team had spent 3 weeks infiltrating the facility that processed raw materials for Imperial shipyards. "Charges are set," she reported through her encrypted communication link. "We can take out the entire processing facility and the orbital launch platform." "Copy that, Team 7, came the response from Liberation Command. "Stand by for synchronized detonation." Sarah checked her chronometer. In exactly 17 minutes, sabotage teams across 43 Imperial worlds would simultaneously destroy critical infrastructure installations. The attacks were designed not just to cause damage, but to force the Empire to divide their attention and resources at the crucial moment. She thought about Captain Chen as she made her final preparations. The woman who had started this revolution with a single poisoned bolt would probably be amazed to see how far the rebellion had grown. What had begun as one human's desperate act of defiance had become the largest coordinated resistance movement in galactic history. The countdown reached 0, and Sarah triggered the demolition charges. Across the galaxy, similar explosions marked the beginning of the end for the Zephyrian Empire. Shipyards, communication arrays, fuel depots, and command centers disappeared in brilliant flashes of light as human sabotage teams struck with precision and coordination that the Empire had never encountered before. But the most crucial part of the operation was taking place in the depths of space, where the combined Liberation Fleet was preparing to engage the Imperial Home Guard in the most important battle in galactic history. Marcus Rodriguez watched the tactical display as Prince Casthor's forces moved to intercept the approaching rebel fleet. The Imperial ships were impressive, sleek, powerful vessels that had maintained order across the galaxy for millennia, but they had been designed to fight conventional enemies using conventional tactics. The Liberation Fleet was anything but conventional. "Nexus units, initiate cyber warfare protocols," Marcus ordered. Across the fleet, synthetic intelligences began launching sophisticated attacks against Imperial computer systems. The Zephyrians had never encountered AI-based warfare before. Their own technological philosophy emphasized centralized control and biological decision-making. Their ship's computers were powerful but relatively simple, designed to follow orders rather than think independently. The Nexus Collective had spent months developing viruses specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in Imperial software architecture. Now those viruses spread like wildfire through the enemy fleet, causing navigation errors, weapons malfunctions, and communication breakdowns. "Imperial formation is beginning to break up," reported the tactical officer. "Their ships are having difficulty maintaining coordinated movement." "Gorvani assault squadrons, you're cleared to engage," Marcus commanded. The heavy assault ships of the Gorvani mining guilds surged forward, their plasma weapons lighting up space with brilliant streams of directed energy. The miners had spent centuries developing tools for breaking apart asteroids and extracting valuable minerals from hostile environments. Against Imperial warships, those same tools proved devastatingly effective. But the real shock came when the Imperial fleet tried to respond with their own cyber attacks. They discovered that the Liberation Fleet's computer systems were unlike anything in their experience. Instead of centralized networks that could be targeted and disrupted, the rebel ships used distributed AI systems that could adapt and evolve in real time. When the Zephyrians tried to jam communication frequencies, the Nexus units simply shifted to new bandwidths. When they attempted to override ship systems, the synthetic intelligences rewrote their own code to resist intrusion. For the first time in their military history, the Imperials found themselves facing an enemy that was technologically superior in the one area they had never bothered to develop: artificial intelligence. "Sir," the tactical officer called out excitedly, "Imperial flagship Eternal Dominion is requesting parley." "Prince Casthor wants to negotiate." Marcus felt a moment of bitter satisfaction. The same empire that had demanded humanity's unconditional surrender was now asking for talks. But he also knew that this was probably a delaying tactic. Prince Casthor was likely trying to buy time to activate the core defense system. "Deny the request," Marcus ordered. "Continue the assault." Deep beneath the surface of the throne world, Prince Casthor stood in the control center of the most powerful weapon ever constructed. The core defense system drew its energy directly from the system's star, channeling stellar fire through quantum conduits that could focus that power anywhere in the galaxy. It had taken 8 months to prepare the targeting coordinates for 800 billion victims, but the preparations were nearly complete. "Energy collection at 97%, reported the chief technician. "We can initiate the sterilization protocol in approximately 6 minutes." The prince's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. Let the rebels win their little battle in space. Once he activated the core defense system, every world that had supported the Liberation Front would become a lifeless cinder floating in the void. The lesson would echo across the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. But as he watched the energy levels climb toward full power, alarms began sounding throughout the control center. Security teams were rushing toward the main access tunnels, where intruders had apparently been detected. "Report!" the prince commanded. "Unknown contacts have breached the outer perimeter," came the reply. "They appear to be using some kind of cloaking technology. Our sensors can barely track them." Prince Khazarthur's eyes narrowed. How had rebel forces penetrated the most heavily defended system in the galaxy? The throne world's location was one of the Empire's most closely guarded secrets. The answer came in the form of Captain Vectara herself, leading a strike team of human special forces and Nexus synthetic units through the facility's main corridor. The defector had provided not just intelligence about the throne world's location, but detailed knowledge of its internal layout and security systems. "Energy collection at 99%, the technician announced, his voice tight with panic as explosions echoed through the facility. The prince realized he was out of time. Even if the rebels reached the control center, he could still activate the system and complete his genocide. 800 billion lives was an acceptable price to pay for preserving the Empire. He reached for the activation controls just as the doors exploded inward and Captain Vectara burst into the chamber. "Stop!" she commanded, her weapon trained on her former prince. Khazanthor's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile. "Too late, traitor. The Empire's enemies will burn and order will be restored." He slammed his hand down on the activation switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the massive displays around the control center began showing energy readings that climbed toward impossible levels. The core defense system was powering up, drawing stellar fire through quantum conduits that stretched across space-time itself. But something was wrong. Instead of focusing that energy on distant rebel worlds, the system seemed to be building up power locally, around the throne world itself. "What's happening?" the prince demanded. The chief technician stared at his instruments in horror. "Sir, the targeting coordinates have been changed. The system is focusing all accumulated energy on this location. We have perhaps 30 seconds before dawn." The realization hit Prince Khazthar like a physical blow. The rebels hadn't just infiltrated the control center. They had reprogrammed the entire system. The weapon he had intended to use for genocide was now pointed at the heart of his own empire. Vectara stepped forward, her weapon still trained on the prince. "Surrender, and we'll evacuate as many people as possible before the system discharges. Continue to resist, and everyone on this world dies for your pride." For the first time in his life, Prince Khazthor felt something he had never experienced before: helplessness. The most powerful weapon in galactic history was about to destroy the most important world in the Empire, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. In space above the throne world, Marcus Rodriguez watched in amazement as the Imperial fleet began broadcasting surrender signals. The enemy ships were breaking formation and powering down their weapons, apparently in response to some development planetside. "Liberation Command, this is Flight Leader Sartak," came the transmission from the Alteran stealth wing. "Sabotage mission complete. The core defense system has been reprogrammed and will discharge in approximately 20 seconds. All ships should clear the system immediately." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. If the weapon that had been designed to sterilize 800 billion people was about to discharge at the throne world itself, "All ships emergency withdrawal," he broadcast across the fleet. "Maximum warp, now!" The combined Liberation fleet scattered in all directions as the most powerful weapon in galactic history prepared to turn the heart of the Zephyrian Empire into a miniature star. Below them on the planet's surface, Prince Khazthor stared at the energy readings that spelled the end of 10,000 years of Imperial rule. The last thing he saw before the stellar fire consumed everything was Captain Vectara offering him her hand, a final gesture of mercy from the species he had spent his life trying to destroy. Then the throne world became a brief, brilliant star, taking with it the last symbol of the empire that had ruled the galaxy for 10 millennia. The age of empire was over. The age of freedom had begun. 1 year after the destruction of the Zephyrian throne world, Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in the observation deck of New Geneva Station, watching the most remarkable diplomatic gathering in galactic history unfold in the space around her. Representatives from over 400 species had come to participate in the Constitutional Convention, the first truly democratic assembly ever attempted on such a scale. The diversity was staggering. Crystalline beings from the Andromeda spiral floated alongside gaseous entities from the galactic core. Mechanical intelligences communicated with biological species through translation matrices that had never been designed for such complexity. The universal translator systems had been pushed far beyond their original specifications, creating a linguistic environment where the very concept of communication was being redefined. "It's beautiful," said Captain Rodriguez, joining Elena at the viewing port. The former military commander now served as humanity's chief delegate to the Constitutional Convention, a role that required diplomatic skills he'd never imagined needing during his years fighting Imperial forces. "It's chaos," Elena replied, but she was smiling as she said it. 374 different governmental systems trying to agree on a framework for galactic cooperation. Half the species don't even have concepts that translate to democracy or individual rights. The other half have concepts we can't begin to understand. Through the observation port, they could see the vast array of ships that had brought delegates to the convention. Each vessel reflected the unique aesthetics and requirements of its species. Some were elegant curves of living coral, others were geometric constructions of pure mathematics made manifest. A few appeared to be natural asteroids that had been hollowed out and filled with exotic technologies, while others seemed to exist in a constant state of transformation, their shapes shifting according to purposes that only their crews could understand. "Any word from the Zephyrian delegation?" Marcus asked. Elena nodded toward a cluster of smaller ships maintaining a discreet distance from the main assembly. "They're participating, but it's complicated. 3 different Zephyrian factions each claim to represent the legitimate successor to the Empire. They're having their own civil war while trying to negotiate their place in the new galactic order. The collapse of the Zephyrian Empire had been even more dramatic than anyone had anticipated. Without the unifying authority of the throne world, imperial territories had fragmented into hundreds of independent systems, many of which were now fighting each other over the remnants of imperial resources. Some Zephyrian worlds had embraced the liberation, establishing democratic governments and reaching out to former subject species for reconciliation. Others had declared themselves independent empires, attempting to maintain the old ways on a smaller scale. The most surprising development had come from Captain Vectara and the other Zephyrian defectors. They had formed what they called the Reformed Zephyrian Republic, dedicated to making amends for their species' past actions. It was a small faction, perhaps a few million individuals out of the trillions of Zephyrians scattered across the galaxy, but their moral authority gave them influence far beyond their numbers. The Nexus Collective has submitted their final proposal for the AI Rights Amendment, Marcus continued, consulting his datapad. It's actually quite elegant. They're requesting recognition as a distributed species rather than property or tools. Full citizenship rights, but with acknowledgement that their decision-making processes operate on timescales and in ways that biological species might not understand. Elena nodded. The question of artificial intelligence rights had been one of the most challenging issues facing the convention. Most species had developed AI systems at some point in their history, but few had ever considered them as potential equals. The Nexus Collective's rebellion against the Empire had forced everyone to reconsider what it meant to be a sentient being. What about the Gorvani proposal for resource allocation? Still deadlocked, the mining guilds want to maintain control over their traditional territories, but the newly liberated worlds argue that imperial resource extraction was essentially theft. They want reparations, which is understandable, but the mathematics are impossible. It was a problem that had no easy solutions. The Zephyrian Empire had operated for 10,000 years by extracting resources from subject worlds and redistributing them according to imperial priorities. Unraveling that system while maintaining the economic infrastructure that supported trillions of beings was perhaps the greatest challenge facing the new galactic order. "Dr. Vasquez," called a voice from the conference chamber entrance. Elena turned to see Ambassador Tempur, the Kythara survivor who had become one of the most effective mediators in the convention. His people had paid a terrible price for the rebellion, but somehow Tempur had found the strength to focus on building the future rather than dwelling on past grief. "The Ethics Committee needs you for the final session," he continued. "We're ready to vote on the fundamental principles." Elena and Marcus followed the ambassador into the vast chamber that had been constructed specifically for the convention. The space was a marvel of cooperative engineering, designed to accommodate the environmental needs of hundreds of different species simultaneously. Atmospheric zones shifted gradually from one area to another, gravity fields adjusted to suit different physiologies, and the lighting spectrum covered wavelengths that most humans couldn't even perceive. At the center of the chamber, a holographic display showed the document that had consumed their attention for the past year, the Galactic Charter of Freedom. It was unlike any governmental document ever written, attempting to establish principles that could apply to every form of consciousness in the known galaxy. Elena took her place at the human delegation's position and reviewed the final text one last time. The preamble still gave her chills every time she read it. "We, the free peoples of the galaxy, united not by conquest but by choice, establish this charter to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and all sentient beings. We hold as fundamental truth that consciousness in all its forms possesses inherent dignity, that no species or individual may claim dominion over another, and that the diversity of thought and culture is the galaxy's greatest treasure." "Honored delegates," announced the convention's presiding officer, a hegemony representative whose species had ancient traditions of consensus building, "we call for the final vote on the Galactic Charter of Freedom." The voting process took nearly 3 hours. Some species required unanimous consent from all their representatives. Others used complex mathematical formulas to weight their decisions according to population, resource contribution, and historical factors. A few delegates had to consult with their homeworlds in real time, adding communication delays that stretched across light years. But gradually the results became clear. Species after species endorsed the charter, often with emotional statements about the hope it represented for their people. Even some of the Zephyrian factions voted in favor, acknowledging that the old imperial system had been as destructive to the rulers as to the ruled. When the final tally was announced, 94.7% of the represented species had endorsed the charter. It wasn't unanimous. Some groups remained suspicious of any large-scale governmental organization, preferring to maintain complete independence. But it was an overwhelming mandate for the new galactic order. Elena felt tears flowing down her cheeks as she watched the celebration erupting throughout the chamber. Beings who had never imagined they could work together were embracing across species lines, their joy transcending the barriers of biology and culture. "I wish Sarah could have seen this," Marcus said quietly. Elena nodded, thinking about the woman whose single act of defiance had set all of this in motion. Captain Chen had died believing she was simply buying her species a few more days of freedom. She couldn't have imagined that her poisoned bolt would ultimately lead to the liberation of an entire galaxy. But perhaps that was the most human thing of all, the willingness to act on principle even when victory seemed impossible, to fight for what was right even when the odds were overwhelming. "She did see it," Elena replied. "Every time someone chooses freedom over fear, every time a species reaches out to help another, every time someone refuses to kneel, she's seeing it through us." The Constitutional Convention concluded with the formal signing ceremony, as representatives from hundreds of species added their marks to the charter in forms as diverse as the beings themselves. Some signed with traditional writing implements, others used biochemical markers or quantum signatures. The Nexus Collective embedded their approval directly into the document's electronic matrix, while the crystalline beings from Andromeda inscribed their consent in harmonic frequencies that resonated through the station's structure. But the real work was just beginning. The Charter established the principles of the new galactic order, but implementing those principles across thousands of star systems would require generations of effort. There would be conflicts and misunderstandings, setbacks and compromises. Some species would struggle with the transition from imperial rule to self-governance, while others would push the boundaries of what cooperation could accomplish. 6 months later, Elena found herself back on Earth for the first time since the rebellion began. The planet had been largely abandoned during the war, its population evacuated to safer worlds as the Zephyrian Empire focused its retaliation efforts on humanity's birth world. But now people were returning, and the great cities were slowly coming back to life. She launched a poisoned bolt at the alien queen. What happened next? HFY Stories.